Independent member for Bass.
Here.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I rise today to also add my contribution to the budget reply and to share my thoughts and observations in relation to the 2023-24 Tasmanian budget. Preparing a complex budget is never an easy task, and I would like to thank the Treasurer and the Department staff for their work in delivering this set of documents to us. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank all my colleagues here in the Chamber that have delivered their contribution, and specifically to thank the Leader of the Opposition as well as the Leader of the Greens for their budget contribution. And I have to say that I have also, looking through those documents, I have to say that there are parts of them that I quite like. So,
thank you, Mrs. Alexander.
I fully acknowledge that formulating this year's budget was never going to be an easy task. Looking into an uncertain economic future and also coming from a position where Tasmania, like many other places around the world, reached deep into the coffers to keep things going over the last 2 years. However, the big question is, how does one remove the hand gently from the coffers while still keeping a balanced flow in and out of the box? In other words, how do we readjust and reposition to ensure we manage the best we can with our limited resources? Mr Deputy Speaker, in its comprehensive analysis, Treasury identified several revenue risks which we need to be very aware of. The number one risk is the fact that 41.8% of the total general government sector revenue in 23-24 comes from GST. We do not control the movements of this income. GST collection revenue is highly sensitive to changes in the national consumer spending trends. Changes to the GST pool can have what accountants and economists call a material impact, with as little as 1% change translating into a variation of $35.2 million in the GST revenue. There is also the issue of the Australian government's new GST distribution arrangements, which was legislated in 2018. As a result of this new arrangement, Tasmania and most other states and territories are forecast to be worse off in each year of the budget and forward estimates. Based on current modelling, our state could be worse off by around $75 million in 27-28, but of course this assumes that all other factors remain unchanged. Mr Deputy Speaker, the second largest source of revenue for Tasmania are the payments made by the Australian Government for specific purpose through the Intergovernmental Agreement on Federal Financial Relations. There are a number of inherent risks for our state under these arrangements. This comes from the prescriptive nature of the agreements that include requirements for matched funding, maintenance of effort, transfer of risks to the state, and onerous reporting and input controls. As Treasury clearly identifies, these impose additional budgetary risk to Tasmania and reduce our flexibility to fund our own expenditure priorities or respond to specific financial pressures. Income diversification is a well-known financial strategy to spread financial risk and ensure sustainability. However, this is not something available to us right now. The restriction in our sources of income and the level of debt unfortunately reduces our capacity to be nimble and to respond to outside factors better. The impact of the one-off federal funding becomes quite obvious when looking at the net operating balance, which on the face of it shows an improvement from a loss of $297.5 million in 23-24, changing into a positive of $61.2 million by the end of 26-27. But is it so? Are we going to actually improve our bottom line? No, we are still going to be recording a loss. This is because of the accounting treatment, where receipts for the Australian government funding for capital programs, especially the one-off major projects, are recognised under general government sector revenue, without also recognising the corresponding expenditure on infrastructure projects. The effect is that we have an improved net operating balance. However, when removing this extra line of revenue, which is tied to specific capital expenditure, we have in effect a loss of $756.7 million for 23-24, and we continue with a loss until the end of the 26-27 financial year. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the budget has a significant amount of infrastructure investment, and I do appreciate that roads and bridges are very important in order to keep things moving. However, with 55% of the infrastructure investments going to roads and bridges, one is left wondering if maybe our priorities should have been rebalanced more towards increasing investments in hospitals, health, schools, education and skills. In a recent report prepared by the OECD, looking at how best to prioritise infrastructure investment in order to stimulate the economy in a post-COVID era, it was identified that, and I quote, "The projects that are most likely to deliver the required economic stimulus are those already in the pipeline, with cleared planning and environmental approvals, awaiting only funding. Maintenance backlogs in particular are suitable targets. Attempts to bypass consultation and approval processes for less advanced projects can be highly counterproductive, resulting in legal challenges and lengthy delays. New mega projects cannot be expected to deliver anything in the timescale required. The necessary critical investment mass should be achieved by a large volume of smaller projects that can be initiated quickly, including maintenance projects. Distributing funds to local authorities for disbursement can enhance the speed of project delivery, they also say. And finally, project selection should also take careful account of long-term policy priorities, especially addressing social equity." Taking the OECD statement and looking at the budget, it brings into focus the question of infrastructure priorities. With $60 million allocated in the financial year 2023-24 towards the AFL package High Performance Centre, whilst only $68.8 million is allocated to Homes Tasmania.
Yeah.
It is understood that $68.8 million is a grant to support borrowing costs associated with a planned capital program expenditure. However, there isn't enough visibility in the current Treasury papers to establish the dimensions of the planned capital program and its structure in relation to current and expected community needs. One of the new mega projects our state is considering is, of course, Marinus Link, Battery of the Nation and the Northwest Transmission developments, for which the current estimated costs are in excess of $6.4 billion. This level of investment has a high level of materiality, as Treasury has identified, and I quote, "A final investment decision will be made by the government in December 2025. Substantial costs will be incurred by the government and government businesses to progress these projects over the term of 23-24 financial year. Budget and forward estimates. Decisions with potential significant impact on the general government and total state sector financial position will be required to be made. There is a risk that prior to final investment decision being made, there will be a requirement to underwrite or pre-commit significant funding to the early works. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this underwriting, of course, carries a certain amount of financial risk, as we are going through an uncertain economic time of great disruption in the supply chain and a fluctuating Australian dollar. Through the 23-24 budget, though the 23-24 budget has a number of positive initiatives in health, education and supporting Tasmanians with cost of living, these good initiatives are somehow overshadowed by the level of borrowings and the question of how we are going to repay it when faced with a number of variables in our revenue, but also in our risks, which are outside our control. Our borrowings will increase from $4.125 billion in 23 to $6.677 in 2027. The increase in borrowings is to support the general government sector cash deficit. In other words, we are borrowing to pay our deficits, which are resulting from operating expenditure, but also from our debt repayments.
That's right.
The Tasmanian Public Finance Corporation, that holds most of the borrowings, has 39 fixed-rate loans with maturities out to 2041-42. Though outside the forward estimates of this particular budget, it is expected that 11 out of the 39 loans will mature in 29-30. Putting this into perspective, our decisions today and in the immediate future need careful consideration so we do not kick the can down the road for others to pick it up later. One of indicators that is generally viewed as a positive indicator is the state final demand. An increase in this indicator is a good thing, signifying things are moving in the right direction. However, when breaking down the areas that will contribute to growth, it shows that government consumption is the main driver, with business investment reducing, as well as public investment and household consumption reducing as well. Mr. Deputy Speaker, as I said previously, the budget has a number of positive initiatives, and in identifying them, I'll focus on how Tasmanians are supported with the cost of living. Among these, the $40.6 million over 4 years in concessions for water and sewage bills, and importantly, this concession is actually indexed to CPI annually. Continuing the successful school lunch program and adding $360,000 to support schools with purchasing of kitchen equipment and implementing the program. Also funding through the Family Assistance Program to provide direct relief to families suffering financial hardship. Though this funding hasn't actually been clearly articulated, if it is at a similar level to previous years, is it adjusted for CPI or adjusted to reflect the current situation of increased need in our community? It is pleasing to see $600,000 funding provided to Salvation Army street teams in Launceston and Hobart, as well as funding of $180,000 per year for 3 years to Grants Van, Lewis Van and Mission Beat to serve our community. These are very good initiatives, Mr. Deputy Speaker. However, with funding not adequately indexed, the capacity to service as many people as possible will be limited. In relation to supporting the work of community organisations, I have looked at what has been promised in this budget. In his statement, Minister for Community Services and Development, the Honourable Nick Street, said the Rockcliffe Liberal Government is delivering the essential services Tasmanians need to improve the well-being of individuals, families and communities. And I quote, "We know cost of living pressures are being felt right across Australia, and in Tasmania we know household budgets are being stretched," he said. In these circumstances, neighbourhood houses across the state have continued to provide vital assistance to Tasmanians who need help connecting community members and service providers. It's because of this that the government is investing $2.4 million in the 23-24 Tasmanian budget towards neighbourhood houses, including, and now it's broken down, $1.75 million for Tasmania's neighbourhood houses. Each of the Tasmanian houses in the neighbourhood house network will receive, and I quote, additional $50,000. However, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I do not believe this is additional funding. And I say this because in the 21-22 budget, funding for the 34 neighbourhood houses was allocated at an average of $41,176 per house, or otherwise calculated as $1.4 million per year for 2 years. This funding looks more to me as a continuation of the funding that expired after the 2 financial years of 21-22 and 22-23. Which has now been adjusted and rounded to $50,000 per house, or roughly an additional $300,000 from previous funding, not an actual additional $1.4 million as stated. The budget also provides for $435,000 in extended core funding over 3 years to continue community family support programs at Kentish House. This is equivalent to $145,000 per year. Mr. Speaker, because in effect, this is actually not additional funding, it is merely a continuation of the exact yearly funding provided in 21-22, and also unfortunately this has not been indexed, so it is not additional funding, it is still the same 145 but extended into the financial year of 23-24. The statement continues with the Rockcliffe Liberal Government acknowledges that community service organisations servicing local communities are feeling the effects of rising costs on many aspects of their operations. That is why we are providing $2.1 million community support assistance package to help ease pressures of rising costs of service delivery, Minister Street said. We will work closely with the sector to determine how this money is invested to ensure it has the greatest impact. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I do hope the department will actually consult with the sector towards the best way in which to support their work. Otherwise, if I do a simple calculation of dividing the $2.1 million by the almost 120,000 Tasmanians that are estimated to live below the poverty line, the amount represents roughly about $17.50 per person relief. And I'm not sure how much impact a one-off, approximate $18 for one person will make. The Minister also said we are committed to a comprehensive review of funding models for the community service organisations to ensure funding provides long-term certainty, has clear outcomes and adaptable service provision. Unfortunately, it is not a review of the funding models that the community service organisations need right now, but rather more support. If we are talking about a review, well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, one should turn to recommendation number 35 of the PESRAC report, which identified place-based recovery as essential. What this recommendation said was that the state government and its agencies should actively seek out and fund community-led activities, prioritising increased community connection, which includes collaboration across community organisations, primary prevention of and early intervention in areas such as family or community violence and drug and alcohol misuse, and models which promote new and innovative strategies to engage volunteers. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, there is already a recommendation and the government just needs to ensure funding is adequate and also ensure good implementation. The Minister also commented that, quote, "This is a carefully considered budget that prepares Tasmania for the future and at the same time supports our most vulnerable." Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, it very much remains to be seen how prepared we are for the future and how much our vulnerable are supported. Unfortunately, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I am not convinced that this budget delivers on the long-term complex preventative measures which are required in health, education and support services to also empower people and ensure they ultimately get a hand up and build much needed resilience.
Hear, hear.
Hear, hear.
I think that's it.
Honourable Treasurer.